All right, welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue with where we left off as far as our reproductive material. As I mentioned in previous videos, this unit will probably be a little bit longer than our average as far as about 7 videos for a normal length unit. Probably going to be closer to like 8 or 9 for this one. We'll just see how we continue progressing. So the last thing we mentioned, we were discussing these different phases of menstruation and how the endometrium changes throughout all of this. I really like this picture just because it kind of visualizes exactly what's happening throughout the menstrual or uterine cycle. And you see how the endometrium changes. You have this drastic drop off of tissue, and then it builds back up through proliferation and inevitably builds up even further through the secretory phase in preparation for a new egg, especially if it were to be a fertilized egg. So overall, pretty important stuff. Okay, now we get to talk a little bit about some of the hormones that are associated with this. Now, this is not brand new because we've actually talked about this back in endocrine system when we did an entire chapter associated to hormones. But we're kind of just digging this back up because obviously this is reproductive system, so we should have a good understanding on how these hormones affect different aspects of reproduction. And in this case, it's going to be more in the female reproductive side of things. So first and foremost, one of the major hormones secreted by the ovaries is going to be estrogen. This is one of the primary sex hormones produced by these follicular cells, causes secondary sex characteristics. Typically speaking, secondary sex characteristics are basically the things that you'd expect to see during puberty, both in men and women. So in women, for instance, enlargement of accessory organs, development of breasts, appearance of pubic hair, increase in fat beneath the skin, widening and lightening of the pelvis, and the beginning of menses or the menstrual cycle. So overall, basically helps to kickstart a lot of those things that you expect to see, like we mentioned, during puberty. Progesterone. This is another major hormone secreted by the ovaries. It's produced by what's called the corpus luteum. Again, that's a structure found inside the ovaries. We don't need to get too in-depth with regards to the corpus luteum. I'm fine with just knowing it's associated to the ovaries. But production continues as far as of progesterone until luteinizing hormone, or LH, diminishes in the blood. Progesterone plays a major role in the maintenance of pregnancy, so making sure that pregnancy stays healthy and functional. Speaking of, now we get to transition into the stages of pregnancy and development. So we're going to discuss a little bit relating to fertilization, embryonic development, fetal development, and then finally childbirth. So we do need to have good understanding of how this whole process works step by step. So let's first talk about fertilization. Fertilization on a literal aspect is when the sperm fuses with the egg. So that's the exact process that has to happen. Now, obviously, getting there can be challenging, and this is what we kind of see here. The oocyte, or the ova or the egg, is viable for 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So, AKA, your best window of time for the sperm to fuse with the egg is anywhere from 12 to 24 hours after it has been released from the ova. Granted, for couples that are trying to get pregnant, many times they're suggested to have multiple instances of attempting to get pregnant before the ovulation, during ovulation, and even after ovulation. Because again, as we've mentioned previously, the lifespan of sperm can vary dramatically. The vast majority of them will die before they even reach the cervix. But because this lifespan can vary so dramatically, you kind of have to play with the numbers and say, okay, well, maybe this will be it. Viability, what we see here when you see those words viable, it's just indicating like your best window of time, right? So for instance, most sperm, their best window of time, as far as most viable, is 12 to 48 hours after ejaculation. And notice the hours can be variable and different. That's why we were mentioning that many times for couples trying to get pregnant, they'll try to do this multiple times just to see if hopefully it works this time. It's also a big reason why, in the instance that a woman takes a pregnancy test, you should only be taking said pregnancy test after a couple days have passed of sexual intercourse, especially associated to possibly ovulation. For example, taking a pregnancy test the day after the odds of that being accurate are not great. So it's a lot more better to just say, okay, 2 or 3 days have passed. Let's see where we're at with this. Sperm cells must make their way to the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes as we call them, for fertilization to be possible. Again, the ova or the ovaries release those eggs, right? 1 a month. They crawl their way through the fallopian tube through what we call the cilia. It takes a while to make its way through to the fallopian tube, but after the fallopian tube, if no fertilization occurs, that egg simply attaches itself to the endometrium of the uterus and just sheds off through that menstrual cycle. So it cannot, by the time it's reached the uterus, the sperm cannot be fusing with it. It's too late. It has to be fertilized in the fallopian tube. So here's exactly what we see. The development from ovulation to the implantation. So once again, you have that release of the egg via ovulation. You see the egg starting to secrete. Sometimes the sperm can make their way so far up. In this case, if you can't really see it, all the way up in here, pretty close to where the ovaries would be. So it just depends on the longevity of the sperm, how long they've been able to survive, how long they haven't been destroyed by the female reproductive system yet. So it just varies, but we'll see this fusion occur. Now, there are some terms here that you're seeing pop up. So there are technical terms that we use to identify a fertilized egg, depending on the stage in which that egg is, right? So first and foremost, obviously, when the sperm has fused with the egg, technically speaking, we can't call that a baby or anything like that, right? It's still almost a single-cell organism. It's technically a two-celled organism. We call that the zygote. It's just two different haploid cells, in this case the egg and the sperm, fusing together, combining their chromosomal count, and then inevitably reproducing itself, undergoing rapid mitosis. We see that rapid type of mitosis that we see here. Eventually we form what's called the blastocyst, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and that's going to fuse to the uterus. After it fuses to the uterus, it can nourish much faster, it can start growing and developing actual organs, all the intricacies of what you'd expect to see during a healthy pregnancy. So a little bit about the mechanisms of this. Membrane receptors on an oocyte pulls in the head of the first sperm cell to make contact. So interestingly enough, the ova, the egg, has this special membrane around it that as soon as a sperm hits it, it creates like a force field, the way I think of it. Meaning, in the instance that numerous sperm reach the egg, the only one that matters, the only one that counts is first place. As soon as that one reaches the egg, it's going to prevent any other sperm from fusing or from reaching it or anything like that. So that's a rather interesting concept here, and that's what we see here. A membrane of the oocyte does not permit a second sperm head to enter. The oocyte then undergoes its second meiotic division. Fertilization occurs when the genetic material of a sperm combines with that of an oocyte to form what we call the zygote. Once again, I'm just going to underline that so we're all on the same page of that term. But that's just what we call the fertilized egg that has fused these chromosomal counts together to create what humans have, 46 chromosomes. Now, there are instances where, of course, twins can occur, or triplets, or quadruplets, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have differences between fraternal and identical twins. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we continue progressing. But it essentially has to do with, did the egg split immediately? Sometimes that happens, that when the sperm fuses with the egg, an immediate split occurs, which is not normally the case. Or there are other instances where the ovaries sometimes secrete more than one egg. If more than one egg is secreted and both get fertilized almost around the same time, usually as far as twins are concerned, their differences is a matter of minutes or maybe even hour on the long side as far as how old they are. But that's another instance. And again, it's how you identify fraternal versus identical. Obviously, the identical version of twins is going to be more of that split that occurred on a DNA level. They're copies of each other. But if you've ever met identical twins, they're very different people. It has to do with the whole nature versus nurture argument. You can have identical twins and have them look, as the name implies, identical and very similar. But personality-wise, they can be totally different people, which is fascinating. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, they can look similar, but you can have many times where fraternal twins are, for instance, a boy and a girl, You can have fraternal twins that just like one color hair and a different color hair. So that can be a little bit more distinct. We'll put it that way. All right. The zygote. As we mentioned, the zygote is the first new cell. That's a great way to put it, what we see here in our first bullet. The first cell of a new individual. So really want to hammer that home as far as the importance of the zygote. It is the result of the fusion of DNA from sperm and egg. The zygote begins rapid mitotic cell division, so rapid levels of mitosis. The zygote stage is in the uterine tube, now moving towards the uterus. So while it's in the fallopian tube, we still are calling it the zygote. Next, we're going to have what's called the embryo. Developmental stage from the start of cleavage until the 9th week. So not a bad idea to understand this time period, right? So from the start of cleavage, aka when the cells have started replicating after it's become a zygote, until the 9th week, the embryo first undergoes division without growth. The embryo enters the uterus at the 16 cell state, so it's replicated quite a number of times. The embryo floats free in the uterus temporarily, and then uterine secretions are used for nourishment. So the uterus literally will secrete its own compounds to nourish the embryo before it has officially attached itself. Finally, this is when things start to become a little bit more interesting. We form what's called the blastocyst. The blastocyst is technically under that embryonic stage, but it's just another name for the cell, for the new life forming. But this is a ball-like circle of cells. Notice, big difference here, begins at about 100 cells. So you've done a lot more replication. Secretes a special protein called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, to produce the corpus luteum to continue producing hormones. The blastocyst implants in the wall of the uterus by day 14. So by day 14, you're going to have that attachment process occur, and it should basically be on autopilot. It should be able to nourish from the uterus and grow substantially, assuming no problems occur. That HCG, by the way, that is one of the ways that you can guarantee if someone is pregnant. A traditional pregnancy test tests a protein found in urine. Now, this special protein is typically secreted only when a blastocyst is formed. Granted, there are false positives. There are also false negatives. There are instances where a woman were to take a pregnancy test and it's not the exact correct answer. That does happen from time to time, especially if the body thinks that there might be a fertilized egg, which can be tricked into that. This method is what's usually always done, assuming, let's say if you're trying to get pregnant, you take a pregnancy test, things look positive. After that, you would do an HCG test. So they actually test for this particular protein. And if they find it, congratulations. That's the guaranteed way to prove if someone is officially pregnant or not. So just going back up here a little bit just to see what we were mentioning. Again, this just shows us our different stages of what we consider to be life, right? So once again, we always start with the zygote stage. So just be aware of that. From the zygote stage, it's going to move into this whole area here. All of this is going to be the embryo. And as we discussed, in the embryonic stage, it's literally up to 9 weeks, first trimester, right? In the embryonic stage, we have this special stage right here where it's called the blastocyst, and it just fuses, inevitably fuses to the uterus so that it can maintain itself for longer periods of time and actually nourish properly. Okay, going down. Okay, here we see that same picture again. So it's what I was just showing you guys. So after implantation, what we end up seeing. Development after implantation, the chorionic villi, projections of the blastocyst develop. These are just special cells that form around the blastocyst. Don't have to worry too much about that. They cooperate with cells of the uterus to form what we call the placenta. A lot of you have likely heard of that before. So now we're starting to form the placenta. The embryo is surrounded by the amnion. I've talked about that in the past. Amniotic fluid. The reason why I talked about that in the past is because there's been a lot of incredible research using amniotic fluid to possibly replicate stem cells. So you can kind of see where a lot of this stuff is starting to connect. And then finally, an umbilical cord is going to form. to attach the embryo to the placenta. The umbilical cord is eventually going to be the much more complicated, or not complicated, but complex, put it that way, the much more complex method of nourishing the embryo and nourishing the new life. Because there does come a point that there's so many cells replicating and so many structures starting to form that it's not enough to just absorb nutrients from the uterus just direct. You need more. So what the placenta and the umbilical cord do is that it actually bypasses having to go through the uterus, and it gives nourishment straight from the mother as far as her dietary consumption. So that's an easier way for the embryo to get what it needs. And here we see these early stages of what we were mentioning, right? Here we just see the uterus once again. We start to see what's forming as far as that blastocyst embryonic stage. Inside the embryo, we start to see a lot more complication occurring, right? We start to see the early stages of the amnion. We start to see the early stages of the umbilical cord. This is all stuff that starts to develop as we get further and further along. Finally, a good place for us to stop. We could talk about the functions of the placenta. And there's some interesting discussion relating to the placenta that I'll share when we finish this up. The placenta forms a barrier between the mother and the embryo, so that blood is not exchanged. It has to filter through. Delivers nutrients and oxygen. That makes sense, right? When the baby forms, it's going to have its lungs even as a fetus or in the late embryonic fetal stages. But obviously, it's not breathing when it's in the womb, so it needs oxygen from the mother. That makes sense. And the nutrients. Removes waste from the embryonic blood. Again, even though the fetus will have its own liver and kidneys and all these organs developing, the mother is going to remove the waste for the baby. Becomes an endocrine organ. Produces hormones. It takes over for the corpus luteum. So technically speaking, the placenta becomes a temporary organ, which is interesting, and it secretes its own special hormones such as estrogen, progesterone. So it kind of takes the role of the ovaries, since the ovaries are no longer functioning right now, right? If the egg was already released and the egg was already fertilized and the egg is growing, there's no point of secreting eggs until the baby's birthed. So the placenta takes the role for that. And then other hormones that help to just maintain pregnancy overall. So the other thing I wanted to mention associated to the placenta, it's kind of like a cultural background, or cultural differences. It is very much so dependent on the mother as far as what their decisions are with this. But some cultures utilize the placenta after birth. So first and foremost, when a child is born, of course, they're going to be born and the umbilical cord is still going to be attached, and they have to cut the umbilical cord. And that's where your belly button is, right? But the placenta also comes out too. Normally, and I say normally in Western cultures, the placenta will just be disposed of in a medical waste bag. But in some cases, and again, culturally speaking, it just varies, there are people that will keep the placenta and use it for future purposes. I've seen so much as making the placenta into like a shampoo or conditioner and like washing their hair with it. Quite a number of different cultures eat the placenta, not raw, obviously. They will cook it into other compounds that they would eat. Like I've seen placenta used and mixing with like ground beef to make like burgers. Stuff to us that seems kind of crazy, but it's all cultural differences. On a purely nutritional, anatomical level, are there any problems with that? Not really, because if you think about it, the placenta has rich level of nutrients because its entire job was nourishing the baby and keeping the baby functional. So yes, that is a plausible thing. It's just for, again, a lot of people like in the Western cultures and Western hemisphere probably are not too fond of the idea of that. But some people do that. So again, it just varies based off of cultural differences. But that's where we're going to stop. Again, we're at 5364, so I'm predicting 1 or 2 maximum more videos, so shouldn't be too bad. But thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you in the next one.